Well, welcome and good afternoon. My name is Sarah Dean, and I serve as the president of the South Coast Interfaith Council. The South Coast Interfaith Council is the oldest and largest interfaith council in the South Bay and Long Beach. In 2004, the board voted to move from being Christian only to becoming interfaith so that people like me could be a part of the conversation and community. Today, I'm here to share with you another installation of our program called Custodians of Care. During the pandemic, all of us have been struggling, some in smaller ways, some in bigger ways, but we've all been hurting and feeling a little bit more vulnerable. And in these moments of vulnerability, we seem to have softened our hearts and taken a little bit more notice of people who might be struggling around us under normal circumstances. Maybe we haven't noticed before or paid as much attention as we could or provided as much support as we could. So every week we try to highlight a local nonprofit organization serving an underserved or marginalized community. So today, I'm particularly grateful to have a guest speaker who will share the experience and perspective of a group of people who, despite being part of our communities, we often shut them out of our hearts and our minds. Our fellow human beings who find themselves in and around the criminal justice system, impacted by incarceration. And we're double lucky today because our guest is also a practitioner of one of the indigenous Mexican faith traditions, specifically the Totorame culture. So whereas normally I share a piece of scripture or a tradition from one of our beautiful faith communities, today I invite our guest, Jose Osuna of Restore Inc. to share a teaching from his community. Hi, Jose, how are you?
Hi, Sarah, I'm doing well.
Thank you
blessed
so
to
much.
be here today.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're very busy, so I really appreciate your time. Please, if you could start us off with the teaching from your tradition.
Absolutely. Every culture and every faith has their own way of doing things. And with my people and with a lot of indigenous people of the what are known now as the Americas, storytelling was a way of praying, and it was a way of expressing messages especially to young people. And so I'm going to tell a short story from the Totorame culture that has been passed down for many generations. And it has varied over the years. And so as it gets carried on, it gets modernized. And so I'm going to give you all a modern version of a very old Totorame story. And I will base myself as the main character in the reflection. When I was young, my father sent me away from the land where we lived. And he sent me back to the land where he had come from. It's a land called Sinaloa in the country of Mexico. He sent me there to keep me safe. Now, the town where I ended up at had a lot of tourist traffic. And because I had come from the United States, I knew the language that most of those travelers spoke, English, as well as the native language, which was Spanish. Because of this, a lot of those folks, when they encountered me, would use me as a guide to take them to places where only the locals knew about. One of those places was a cliff that overlooked the Pacific Ocean. One of the things that happened at this cliff was that villages would come, entire villages of people, and they would celebrate, and they would jump off this cliff in celebration and swim in the ocean and climb back up and do it all over again, many, many times. And they were people of all ages, both young and old, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, cousins, elders, babies. Everybody partook in this celebration. And so I started to take travelers there, and they would see this, and some of them would do it as well. I never did. I used to be amazed at how fearless some of those folks were. In particular, this very young boy that could have been maybe 4 or 5 years old at the time. I would see him run and jump and fly through the air before he disappeared over the cliff into the ocean. And he would run up the side of the cliff and do it all over again. Always, as he flew, this amazing laughter. And finally, I could not contain my curiosity. And when he came up the cliff, one of those times I asked him, "Why aren't you afraid?" Because that's all that I felt as I looked over the edge of the cliff was fear. And yet he was so much younger than me, and he did it without any of that fear that I felt. And he told me two things. First, he told me of his life at home and how terrible it was. And he told me, when I jump off the cliff, it's the only time that I feel free. Mm. And with that, he turned around and he ran. And as he ran, he looked and he told me, "Jump, come with me." And he disappeared over the side of the cliff one more time. And I walked to the edge of the cliff and I looked down and he was in the water. And he told me, "Jump." I did. The water's fine. The moral of the story is this: we must not hesitate when it is our time to jump, especially, and most especially, if others have already gone and shown us the way. So that is the story and the reflection that I offer us today. Thank you for allowing me to do that, Sarah.
Thank you. You gave me goosebumps. That was really good. Thank you so much. I cannot, I know that was more of a metaphor, but I've seen people do that, jumping off the cliffs into water. I am not one of those people. Thank you so much. Please tell us a little bit about yourself. You know I live in a community where a lot of my neighbors may have never had the opportunity to have a conversation with you or someone who's had your experience. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Right. So, many things have happened to me in my life, but first and foremost, I come from two individuals, Maria and Benjamin. They were two undocumented immigrants that came to the United States in 1972. And I was their anchor baby. I was born here in the city of Los Angeles. And I was the start of their life here. And, we grew up on the west side for a little while of Los Angeles, and then eventually we came to the city of Long Beach. I started elementary school here in Long Beach. And very early on, I discovered that, where we moved, it was a place that was full of crime and drugs and gangs and violence. But it's really all I knew. So it was my community. And at the age of 9, because of that, I joined a gang, one of the local gangs in Long Beach. And I, took part in that lifestyle from the age of 9 to the age of 35.
9. That's hard for me to wrap my head around.
It was a different time. I came up in the 80s where, gang banging was really glorified in many ways. And it was glorified not just through the media, but when you stepped outside of your home, if you lived in certain areas in the United States in the 80s, you saw that the men and the women that had the things that you wanted to have or needed to have were those folks that were selling drugs, were those folks that were gang members, were those folks that were hustling and doing what they had to do, creating these sub economies, these underground economies that still exist to this day in communities of low income. But so it was very natural for me to just step into that.
But how does a 9-year-old fit into a gang? Like, what does that look like?
It looks like that's how young gang members were at that time. I just did what my friends were doing. It wasn't an overt act of criminality. It wasn't this process where I said, I'm going to join this gang and I'm going to travel the world. It wasn't like that. It was like, this is the neighborhood I grew up in. These are my friends. And this is what we're doing. Because this is just the way it is here. You know, there was no questioning it. And I feel like to this day, that exists in a lot of under-resourced and forgotten communities, you
So it
know,
was,
where
are you saying it was like just a way for you to be in community? It wasn't like you were maybe taking a specific action. Like you said, you weren't thinking, I'm going to go join a gang now. You were just being a part of the fabric of your community, a participant, an active participant.
Right. I was hanging out with other 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and there were some 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds that were already gang members. And we wanted to hang out with them. We didn't particularly want to be like them. We wanted to hang out with them. We wanted to be a part of. We wanted to be, like you said, part of this community that we witnessed, that we saw, and that we ended up becoming a part of. You know, when I spent time at Homeboy Industries, you know, which is an organization in Los Angeles, it's the world's largest gang rehabilitation organization under Father Greg Boyle. You know, one of the things that he taught me there was that nothing trumps gangs like community. You know, because gangs are a substitute for the communities that reject us, for the communities that choose to separate themselves from us, whether it be because of our color, whether it be because of our wealth class or lack of, you know, whatever the case may be, because we look different, because we speak differently. You know, that there's a great history to this country around diversity, but there's also this very sad history around diversity for this country, and how well received that diversity has been at times, and how poorly received that diversity has been at times.
And I think you just said something really important, because I think there are these two voices in our country today, right? One voice saying, stop talking about racism. You're keeping it alive by talking about it. We live in a good country. It's not a bad country. And then there's the other voice that's saying racism is alive and well, and there are problems. But what you just said is it's both, right? It's both. There is goodness in the people here, and there's also not so goodness, right? There's both.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You know, a guy like me, for the things that I've done in my life, you know, I went on to, you know, become a very hardcore, violent gang member, and did a lot of terrible things. And what I got was prison time, right? And there's this inequality around prison, right? But I also recognize I'm very centered in truth. I also recognize that for what I've done, the criminal acts that I've committed in my life, for whatever the reason, whatever the barriers and the systemic barriers and obstacles and all those things, whatever led me to commit those criminal acts, other countries would have dealt with me in a very much more severe way. And so I acknowledge that as well, that there's work to be done here in the United States, but we've continued to stay in the process. That's the other thing. This country doesn't rest. It continues to take a few steps forward. Sometimes it takes some steps back, but we continue to step forward. That's why I am very proud to be part of the web that makes up this country and my community. You know, I'm grateful that now I'm actually part of a real community, right? I didn't have to create or become part of a pseudo community. I can be part of our actual community, and my voice is valid. But there was a long time where I didn't feel that way, and I believe that that's why I acted out. You know, and I spent 13 years of my life in prison as a result of a lot of things, things that I did, things that were done to me, the way the system is, the way the system isn't, you know. But I definitely feel it was because, you know, contributed to because I was brown. I am brown. I'm a brown man. I'm a man that does not have a college degree. I'm a man that ended up with a whole bunch of tattoos, you know. And so, you know, society looks at me a certain way still to this day. And I acknowledge that there are barriers. But I refuse to believe that I have no choice in the destiny of my own life, especially being a man that's not incarcerated currently, that has come to understand how to bring about some change through advocacy and organizing and those kind of things, you know. And so, you know,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Well, you were telling us about you were 9 years old and you entered this form of community in gang life.
Right.
And then take us back to that time and walk us through again.
I mean, and it became a substitute family for me in many ways. You know, I grew up with my mom and dad, and I still have both of them. Thanks be to God that I have both of them still in my life. They've never been gone from my life. I've been the one that has chosen to leave their lives at times. But they worked when I was young. My father worked long hours and worked on the weekends, and my mother worked during the day because they had to, because that's how they made ends meet, and that's how they were able to go a little bit beyond surviving and save up for a property and a home and those kind of things. You know, they had to do it by not being there at home as much as, you know, maybe I needed them to be. And so, you know, because of that, I really found that community, that family with my friends who ended up becoming my homeboys, my fellow gang members. But, you know, I knew them before we were all gang members. They were my friends, and a lot of them remain my friends to this day, you know, and I lived that life. And because of that life, you know, at the age of 18, I ended up going to prison for the first time. And I was incarcerated that time for 5 years of my life. It was an education, and not in a positive way. I became a much more sophisticated gang member. I became a much more well-connected criminal. And I became very criminally, politically savvy. And so I bring that up because that led to a lot of what I do professionally now and have done professionally for the last, you know, decade and a half. But yeah, I got involved with a lot of the prison politics and the street politics as I, you know, became an older adult. And, you know, I ended up coming out after those 5 years, like I said, very well connected and just continued to live that lifestyle. And because of that, I stayed out almost 2 years. And then I ended up going back to prison for 8 years. And I went to prison for 8 years for a white collar crime that time. First time was for an armed robbery. And then I ended up doing 8 years for embezzlement. And so, like I said, I had become a much more sophisticated criminal. I realized that I didn't need a gun to make money illegally. And so I did that, and I ended up going to prison for 8 years. That didn't change my life. I came out even more well-connected, and I chose to come out and really dive into the criminal element and the criminal lifestyle in the city of Long Beach and the surrounding areas. During that time is when, you know, a very tragic thing happened. I lost a son. You know, I lost a 17-year-old son. And, you know, he was killed by 2 men that came looking for me at my home, and they found him instead. And they ended up killing my son. It's been over a decade since that happened. It was a long time ago. It still feels like it happened yesterday. I'm just able to control myself a little bit more today. But that's not the event, sadly, that changed my life. I'd love to say that, but that's not the truth. It wasn't until, you know, months after his passing that something happened to me. I got arrested. And it, you know, you might say, well, you got arrested before. How was this time different? What was different was I had been on a 3-day binge on drugs and criminal activity. And my daughter, who was 15 years old at the time, my daughter Isabel, called me to give her a ride home from her friend's house. And I went over there, and in the process of picking her up, I got arrested for possession of methamphetamine. And it wasn't the arrest itself. It was the fact that this happened in front of my daughter. And the fact that it happened in front of my daughter and there was this expression on her face, it wasn't sadness. It wasn't disappointment. It wasn't anger. It wasn't any of those things. I had seen those things on many, many people's faces that I love and care about. It didn't matter. What I saw on my daughter's face, which moved something inside of me and broke a piece of me was I saw the same look that I saw on other people's faces that didn't know me at all. There was this look of resignation of course, you're going to jail, Dad. That's just who you are. Of course, you're in the back of a cop car, in front of my friends, in front of my friend's house, and in front of the whole neighborhood to see, because that's who my dad is. And that's just the way it is. So that look of acceptance and resignation is what moved something inside of me, because I thought to myself, wow, my own daughter sees me the way the rest of society sees me. Like, this is just who I am, and that's just the way it is. It's not about deserving anything, or it's just the way it is. And you're a gang member and you're a criminal, Dad, so of course you're going to leave us for years again. And I couldn't deal with that again. I couldn't live with that. And, you know, taking that ride in the back of that cop car to the Long Beach police station, I reached out in prayer. And that's why I'm a huge believer in prayer. I called out to God, to the Creator, as I refer to my God, and the God of so many is the Creator. I reached out to him and I said, please get me out of this one, and I'll never do it again, right? And I had said that prayer many times, but there was something that I added, which I had never added, which I believe God saw sincerity in, which was, I said, and you show me how to do it, because I just don't know how, you know. And I just turned it over to him. And, you know, my dad ended up bailing me out, and because of that, I was able to fight my case from the street, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But, you know, I ended up with a sentence that most people would be very surprised, and I was surprised that I received, you know, which was probation. You know, the judge saw fit to give me another opportunity instead of sending me to prison, which he had all the rights to under the law. But I had really chosen to step into a process of change and transformation, and I liked what I was experiencing, and I liked the fact that I started to see value in myself and my life and my freedom, because I always felt like it was just part of the game, going to jail, going to prison, losing years of your life, losing relationships, hurting people, hurting myself. I always felt like that was just part of the game I was playing. But that last time it all really hit home, and I was extremely grateful that this man saw fit to give me another opportunity.
You said something really interesting. You said in that moment, you saw the look in your daughter's eyes that she saw you the way others saw you, which kind of implies that you wanted her to see something else. Now, is that because did a part of you still believe that you were something else, that you were something more than that criminal?
Oh, always, always. You know, one of the things that's really fascinating to me about my own life is that, you know, during that time of my life, I lived a double life for most of that time. When there were things that were different, that were available for a young kid like me at that time, I took them. I'll give you a very concrete example. I was a Boy Scout at the same time that I was a violent gang member.
Really?
I was a member of Troop 13, which was sponsored and chartered, and I don't know if it still is, out of the First Baptist Church on 10th and Pine in the city of Long Beach. And I would every Monday hide from my friends, from my homeboys, from the gang. I would hide from them. I would put on my Boy Scout uniform, and I would make my way from 12th and Pacific to 10th and Pine to go to my Boy Scout meeting, because it was something different. And I would disappear on the weekends because I was camping with them, and I loved it. And every chance that I got, I would take that opportunity to participate in that. But it was just Mondays. And that fight, the gang won that fight. The Boy Scouts weren't going to win it. The Boys Club wasn't going to win it. You know, my mom wasn't going to win it. The gang was working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, giving me what I felt I needed. They were investing in me, you know?
What does that mean?
That means that they came from a place always of relating to me and providing me with things that I thought I needed at that moment, you know, like money, shoes. But sometimes it was just the companionship. Sometimes it was just being in a space where I was like, we're the same. And because of that, this bond would happen, you know. And so I understand the way that society has viewed gang members for such a long time. And gang members do terribly violent, horrible things that should not be done at all. But I also understand that hurt people, you know. And so if you don't transform your pain, you're going to transmit it. And so I understand that that's what happened there, you know, for a guy like me, for a kid like me.
You're kind of talking about two things here. One is, it sounds like the gang was able to meet more of your needs than like Boy Scouts was able to, or your family was able to. But then this mention of hurt. So was there a part of you, you just said hurt people.
Right.
So was there a part of you that needed to physically react and respond in a violent way because of something that happened to you or something that was happening to you?
I think it was because, and yes, I did want to act out. And I think that it's because of all the hurt that I experienced as a young brown kid, you know, because I grew up in a home that wasn't violent. You know, my father and my mother were not abusive. They're the opposite. They were very loving, very caring. But I experienced pain when I left my house, when I went to school, when I saw the cops deal with my mom in a certain way. You know, I'll tell a really brief story, and this tells us that we should understand that children are always watching, and we are very impressionable when we're little, when we're young. You know, my mom used to work a block from my house. She worked at a daycare when I lived on 12th and Pine in Long Beach. And she came home one day, as she would many times because we were so close during her break. And the reason she came home this day was to pick up some sugar for her workplace's break room because they had run out of sugar for the coffee. And so she went and got a Ziploc baggie full of sugar. And she was walking down the street, and every time she would come home, I would go to our chain link fence and I would look out down at her walking down the sidewalk till I couldn't see her anymore. And so I did that. And this day, she was stopped by a police car. And there were two police officers who stopped my mother. And they got out and they began to harass my mother. And this is before I even knew what the word harassment was or even knew it existed. And they began to mock my mother. And this is what they told her, because my mother didn't speak English. And to this day, she refuses to speak English still. She's been here 48 years. She still refuses to speak English. And that's okay. But they ridiculed her and they told her, how dare you walk down the street in front of us with a bag full of cocaine, knowing that it wasn't cocaine. They just wanted to mess with somebody that day. And they made my mom cry. And they sent her on her way after they got what they wanted, that feeling that they needed to get that day.
Power, exerting power.
And so for me, that was painful. That hurt. And it impacted me in so many ways. And I've been able to process that through some restorative practices. But I came to understand that day, I didn't like my mom either, because it's like, if you spoke English, that wouldn't have happened to you. And so there was some stuff that got moved around that. But then that's where I started to not like law enforcement, because I was like, they picked on my mom, you know, and that hurt, you know, and that hurt. And so how could I ever look at a member of law enforcement as a young child? How could I ever look at a member of law enforcement in a positive way after witnessing that?
How old were you?
I was like 7 years old, you know? And so 2 years later, I'm a member of a gang.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me.
And I hear you. People, it's very strange. Somebody says something to you, you can deal with that. But somebody says something to your parent. I remember my dad's an immigrant. and he's South Asian. South Asian men are not particularly large. They're smaller in frame and stature. And, you know, he's been, go back to your country. You know, he's received that from people towering over him, shouting, mocking. It's really hard as a daughter, as a son, as a child of someone who's having their power taken away, their voice taken away. I can only imagine how much that pained and hurt you that day.
Right.
And you feel powerless, right? Because what could you do for your mom?
Yeah.
You couldn't do anything. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you. And I'm so glad. I'm really interested in hearing how now you've found restorative ways to address this cycle of violence, and we'll get to that. I wanted to kind of take advantage of our time today. Whether many of us realize it or not, we are all a part of the criminal justice system. Whether we directly experience it and we're impacted by the system like you, or whether we impact the system by our votes like me. And yet most of us don't understand this massive American institution. So I wanted to take some time to dig in a little bit more, because I read some statistics the other day that left me just, I mean, I knew to expect numbers like this, but still the numbers are staggering. So according to the Washington, D.C. Bureau of Justice in 2014, quote, America maintains its distinction as a world leader in its use of incarceration, including more than 1.3 million people held in state prisons around the country. Furthermore, in California, here in our state, for every one white person incarcerated, there are 8.8 African Americans incarcerated, and Latinx individuals are incarcerated almost twice as much as their white counterparts. So I really want to see if we can talk a little bit about why do our prisons hold more African Americans and Latinx individuals? What is it about our nation, the systems that we have in place, that leads to more people of color being locked up and cut off from their communities? And it's really interesting because you talked about part of what led you into gang life was a desire to be in community, to have connection with others. And it's interesting because incarceration takes that very thing away and then substitutes it for yet another form of community, which I think we'll get to later on. But I wanted to first talk a little bit about implicit bias. I recently heard someone call in this wonderful gentleman, I'm forgetting his name. He's a physician with the National Medical Association, which is the largest medical association of African American physicians. And he was on CNET doing this wonderful community update on the COVID-19 pandemic. And they invited callers from all around the country to call in and ask him questions. So this one caller gets on, and he's a high school teacher in another state. And this is what he says. He says that, you know, you people talking about racism is causing racism. Racism is gone. We dealt with it, you know. This isn't the 50s anymore. There's no such thing as racism, but when you talk about it, you're causing it. So that's why I thought it's important to talk about, you know, some of the underlying systemic issues like implicit bias. So an implicit bias is defined, implicit or unconscious bias or implicit stereotype is the unconscious attribution of particular qualities to a member of a certain social group. And for example, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm born and raised there. My parents immigrated from Pakistan in the 70s. And when they immigrated, they didn't understand race in America at all. But it's amazing. You absorb it. You know, when you're coming here as an immigrant, you're concerned most about putting a roof over your family's head, just making ends meet, and, you know, hoping that your kids have a good life, right? Better than what you had, or that sort of a thing. So, and you're consuming whatever media is, you know, being sent your way. So I remember when you would drive through Oakland, you know, whatever adult was in the car, lock your doors, you know, because there was this implicit bias that we were in a predominantly African-American community, you know, Latinx community, and there's a feeling that there's a possibility of more violence here or something unpleasant might happen. There's implicit bias, like in this last year, we were watching the Andrew Yang presidential campaign, right? That drew attention to other well-qualified Asian Americans who have run for office unsuccessfully, while lesser qualified non-Asians have won, because there's a bias that many Americans don't feel confident about an Asian leader despite his or her track record, qualifications, and character traits. So I'm not implying that Andrew Yang was the best candidate, of course. I liked a lot of what he had to say, but I wanted to ask you, do you think implicit bias about your social group or ethnic group has impacted your life? First, tell us, what biases do people have about your community, and how do you think that's impacted you?
Well, I mean, my community is so broad and diverse itself, right? So the Latinx community, and then you can break it down by nationalities and cultural backgrounds and all of that, right? So I think that people of color, period, are viewed a certain way in America. Mm-hmm. And I've experienced that, right? There are certain things about me that I think add to that, right? That I've always felt when I walk into a store that I'm looked at. When I express myself, and this happens to this day, when I express myself, when I speak, I get to speak at a lot of places, to a lot of different types of folks. I will almost 100% of the time have someone come up and say, "You're so articulate." And sometimes that tells me, was I not supposed to be? And if so, why would you assume I wasn't going to be?
Your English is so good. I'm like,
right. It's
here.
like, that's because I was born here and it's my first language, right? But there's I've always experienced this implicit bias. Even I'm going to tell you something. It exists not just with white people. It exists in all of us. I have it. You have it. We all have it. Mm-hmm. My mom has it. I know that. And I love examples. So I'll give you a little example of that. When I'm part of the group that founded a little baby nonprofit here in Long Beach called Restore Inc. And so it's myself, it's another former gang member from Long Beach, and a Lutheran pastor named Pastor Kyle Blake of the Gathering Lutheran Church in Long Beach. And so I brought Pastor Kyle to meet my mom. And so I'm introducing him to her, and I'm telling her what we are doing together. And she looks at me, and she looks at him, and she tells me, "So that's your boss?"
Ooh.
And so I'm so grateful for Pastor Kyle. I love him because I was about to get a little heated with my mom, right? All the social justice warrior wanted to come out, right? But Pastor Kyle stepped in and he did the right thing as an ally, and he said, "Mom, he's the boss. He's the leader. I am following him." And that's just the way it is. That's just the way we have it structured. It's not about egos or this and that, but that's the way it is. That's the truth of the way we've, really done the work. And so he wanted to honor that. And it was so hard for my mom to accept that and believe that. First of all, because he's a white man. Second, because, he wears a collar sometimes. And she had seen him with a collar. He wasn't wearing a collar that day, but, I had shown her pictures of him, and those were of him in his collar. And so she could not fathom her son, this brown former gang member that spent, multiple years in prison. She could not fathom that I could be the leader in that dynamic, that I could be even a colleague or an equal with a man of the cloth, with this pastor. I dealt with a lot of that with her, with my mom and her implicit bias when I worked for Father Greg at Homeboy Industries too, and how she views herself, and thus she views me, and the way she sees herself in the world. And it's sad, because she's such a vibrant, rebellious activist in her own way, and she doesn't realize it, because these implicit biases still exist and are embedded so deeply within her.
Yeah, so like you said, we all have implicit biases. It's just a matter of recognizing them within ourselves and being aware. I think they probably stay with us for a long time, but as long as we can recognize them and call ourselves out alongside calling out others when needed. But it's interesting, the other thing with your mom, it's the implicit bias, and then she's internalized the messaging about who she is, who you are, right? She's a consumer also of the messaging that's being put out there, that as a brown man who's been incarcerated, you are X, Y, and Z, right? Imagine a world where we all reflected inward and worked on our own selves and our own biases, and then began every day. Imagine what a world would look like.
Right.
The second thing you mentioned was reminding us that your community is not any one thing, right? And I think that's a really important point. I'm a Muslim, and that's the first step in perpetuating dislike of a group, perpetuating hate. You have to reduce a community to just one thing that can be hateable, despisable, unknowable, right? And so the most important thing we can do is highlight how diverse. It's really hard to hate everybody.
Right. Especially those you know. Especially those you know. That was another great lesson that Father Greg always taught us when I was there with him was, you can't hate those you know. And you'll stop demonizing them once you do. So that was his goal, and it continues to be his goal. And I'm a big proponent of that, is being in community with folks that are not like me, folks that may not have experienced someone like me, and I want to experience folks that maybe I would never experience, in that lifestyle. That's been my personal life mission now, is to see places and meet people that I really restricted myself from in the past.
From our scripture in the Quran, there's this beautiful passage that says, we created you in tribes and nations so you may know one another. And most often we think of tribes and nations as different racial or ethnic groups, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. It just means we created you in all of these different forms and shapes and preferences to know one another. So I think, and just having this, especially in the middle of this pandemic, where opportunities to connect have been really reduced for us. But I just feel like even just sitting across from you on the screen, seeing another human's face and getting to know you, I think we're internally wired to want to know one another. And so when we don't know someone, it creates fear and anxiety, and that's where our ugly side comes out. How do you think the media feeds implicit bias about people from your community? I know for Muslims, it's really painful. It kills me to see my community portrayed violently, because I know lots of Muslims and I don't know a violent Muslim. How do you think communities of color are portrayed today, and how does that impact you?
I think for the most part, because there are always exceptions, but I think for the most part, when there's a brown man in a movie or in a series, he's usually portrayed as, kind of this macho. There's got to be some violence there. And I think that's just really, first of all, disrespectful, because we're a very diverse community. I think it has started to change. I have seen some pieces, the last few years that have been, I think, a bit more realistic in portraying the community that I come from. But the gang member and the convict, they're always very one-dimensional. It's very rare when you get the backstory. It's very rare when you see a story of the trauma that brought that person to be the person that they are, that's portrayed on that screen. I'm not saying people don't have the right to tell stories. We can do whatever we want. That's one of the things that I love about this country. But there's also context. There's also, how did I come to be in a maximum security prison? Was it because I'm 100% a violent person? No, absolutely not. There's a whole lot more complexity to the story. And so I think that's where, in many ways, Hollywood has been irresponsible. I'm really frustrated by the way that we portray ourselves at times through our music. Folks that come from communities of color, I think that it's unfair to young people to kind of portray a picture that there's only one way out of, you know, a community that's under-resourced, you know, with whether it's through sports or entertainment, you know, and so in order to be able to make it in entertainment, you got to have this violent background, you got to have this gangster background behind you, and that's not true anymore. That's not the case. So I think we need to be a little more responsible in how we portray people. And I think that goes beyond just like my community. I really appreciate what you say about the Muslim community, because once upon a time, I had, you know, this very one-dimensional view of the Muslim community. And it wasn't until I allowed myself to experience people from the Muslim community, observe, witness, and partake in some of the traditions, to be open-minded enough and let my spirit be open enough to that. That changed the way that I saw Muslim people, you know. And so for me, that's what so many of us need to do, especially in the media, is tell the real story of people and who they are and how they came to be where they're at, no matter what that place is, whether it's a good place or a bad place. Because sometimes people get to a really good place through some really bad things, and sometimes people get to a bad place through some really good things. You never know, you know, what led someone to be where they're at. So I think the media needs to be a little more responsible in that.
And you know, it's interesting because media, of course, it feeds implicit bias, but it also leads to internalizing the messaging. As we alluded to earlier, you have a young child. So does it concern you what he consumes on TV or will as he gets older? Like, how do you think, is this something that you think about?
It's something that my wife and I always think about, and we always talk about, and we're always very vigilant of that. Is what is this child receiving? What is this child being, you know, influenced by, as far as, you know, the internet, as far as TV, things like that, you know. Right now he's a Star Wars junkie, so it's all about the Force and the dark side, and you know what we do is we try to take what he likes at the moment, and make it about real life, and try to find some real life lessons in it, so that it doesn't just become this kind of, you know, one directional influence by the creators of that content, you know, where we're able to kind of mold some of the story for him and say, listen, that might just be a metaphor for these things, and there's some value there. But I think we have to be very vigilant as parents. I'm grateful that my wife, as a teacher, understands that, you know, every bit of information that especially a child receives, you know, makes an impression. It stays somewhere in the brain. So it is important for us to be vigilant of that and have conversations about what we see, what we watch, what we witness, you know, all of those different type of things. But, you know, Justino, my son, he's very open and very curious. And so he asks a lot of questions, and we try to give him the best answers that we can about everything.
I have to tell you something. I think I should make a disclosure here, because it seems like you guys have established yourselves as a Star Wars family. So I think it's a good time for me to tell you, I come from a devout Star Trek family.
What?
So, yes, my dad, he immigrated in 1970. His dream was to go to outer space. So he started with Star Trek. Me and my brother started watching Next Generation. We watched Next Generation. So he was, and so our ongoing debate used to be, you know, he used to poo-poo on Next Gen and we used to poo-poo on his. I think by now there's been like a zillion other versions and series. I stopped keeping up after they started Voyager.
Well, I'm curious about the newest one, the Picard one, because I was a Picard guy. I like.
Oh, you were.
Oh,
so
yeah.
you dabble in your equal opportunity.
Yes. Diversity is my thing. So I'm.
Oh, I love it. That is inclusivity. I love it.
Yeah.
Absolutely love it.
Yeah.
So I wish we had hours to spend today, because there's just so much to unpack, not just about Star Wars and Star Trek,
Right.
about what is going on in communities of color, and what leads to these numbers that we see, this disproportionate incarceration of people of color. There is a lot of talk about, there are economic systems in place, which we don't have time to talk about today, but like the historical redlining and segregating of our neighborhoods. We might have out-policed segregation, but that doesn't mean we don't have segregation that's been implemented in a different way today. Predatory lending practices, are still rampant. California has recently passed, I think one bill just passed in the assembly last year to address some of that inequities, but the loan sharking in communities of color. So there's these financial structural inequalities baked into our system to keep, certain people of color poor and desperate. And then there's the health disparities between people of color and their white counterparts. We know it's more likely for a person of color to be uninsured and thus lacking access to preventative health care. On top of that, the air we breathe, we don't think about this. The air we breathe is not the same in cities where you have higher numbers of people of color versus affluent white communities. So for example, if you live in a city like Rancho Palos Verdes, which is predominantly white, you're not going to find an oil refinery here, but we put our oil refineries in communities we just care a little bit less about, and that don't have the opportunity. They're so busy trying to make ends meet, they don't have time to advocate as aggressively, to prevent that from happening. So the oil, our refineries end up in communities of color. And so the air is worse. So you're breathing worse air. Food deserts. There's been talk about food deserts. Places in our urban communities, their neighborhoods with people of color have less businesses offering healthy and nutritious meal choices. So you're keeping people of color poor, hungry, sick, pushing them, keeping them on the brink of, in that fight and flight mode all the time, right? So you're looking around and evaluating your options for survival. So you've touched upon this a little bit in your own story, but being a little bit more broader, why do people join gangs? Do certain factors predispose a person to join a gang?
I think that, it's not just why do people join gangs. I think it's why do people make decisions to live criminal lifestyles at times, be hustlers. It's not always just about the gang. But I think that, the root cause is very similar. Lack of resources and I won't say lack of community, because we have communities. We have vibrant communities, within these neighborhoods. But it's the lack of resources. And when we are forced to, make these choices, are they really choices? When the choice is, do I pay the rent by committing this criminal act tonight, sell some drugs, rob somebody, whatever the case may be today, or do I face eviction tomorrow? Is that a real choice? Because I can't get a job because the person that owns the business doesn't trust me from the gate because of their implicit bias as I walk in the door because I'm brown. And now if we're talking about a little bit later on in my life, not just am I brown when I'm walking in, but I'm walking in with a felony background. So it's going to be really challenging me for make legitimate money. So money does make this world go round, sadly. And so, finding yourself in that type of situation, is there really a choice, right? And that comes from, the way we invest in our educational system in these communities. Here in the city of Long Beach, let's just be really honest. Let's just be really, really honest. Let's look at Franklin Middle School, which is one of the middle schools that's part of Long Beach Unified, which is in one of the poorest communities here, one of the more violent communities in Long Beach. And compare it to, let's say, Marshall Middle School or Stanford Middle School. These schools that are in areas and communities in Long Beach that are more affluent, that have a higher per capita that is white in these communities. And so we are very transparent with how we feel about the communities of color that are, not worth our investments, when we show it in how much we invest in these other communities and what we're willing to give these other communities that we're not willing to give the children in these Black and brown and Asian and islander communities here in the city of Long Beach and so many other places, right? We're not unique in that. We're not evil and vile. I'm not saying that. It's just the way the system is set up. So when there's an opportunity to change the system, I think we should dig into that. But there's definitely a lot of systemic barriers that exist that make the choice seem very easy to join a gang when there are no, boys clubs that operate all the time in your neighborhood, when, it's a little bit too dangerous to come outside after 6 o'clock in your neighborhood, then it might start to seem a lot more attractive to go kick it with those guys and those women that are out there still doing their thing. And it becomes real easy to make a choice to become part of that. And so, for me, it wasn't a choice. It was, these are my friends. These are the kids that are my age. I joined the gang at the age of 9. So it was just a natural next step in my life, and I did it. But because of all those things, I do feel judged. I do feel that people look at me a certain way, but I understand that so much has led to that. So much has led to, filling my body with tattoos, which I regret them sometimes, and sometimes I don't. It depends on the day, and it depends on the way people look at me that day, right?
You did tell a story.
Yeah. And so for me, so much has led to me, becoming a gang member and then ending up going to prison, making those choices. But it really was about just the community I grew up in. It wasn't a choice. It was like a natural evolution of Jose and who I was and what was supposed to happen to me.
And it's interesting. I really do think the bias and internalizing the messages that we get through media, through all the information we consume, really also plays a really larger role than we talk about. Years ago in 2004, I got married and moved to Chicago. I was in the middle of dental school, so I did a rotation in South Chicago. So it was a predominantly African-American community, and it was a community clinic. They offered dental care. And so the staff was all African-American. And I remember we'd be sitting around at the lunch table, and they're hard workers, everybody's coming into work, the dental assistants, these are people who have training certificates and whatnot. And I remember sitting around the lunch table with the ladies, and they're talking about their sons and what they want them to do when they grow up. And so they were talking about, my son's really good at ball, I want him to be a ball player. And it was interesting. I'm coming as a South Asian from Silicon Valley, very different atmosphere, right? A privileged atmosphere. And I'm coming here, and their sons that they were talking about, they're smart, they're talented, but the only thing they can imagine themselves doing is playing ball, because I remember asking them when we talked about this a lot, that was the only image of themselves they were seeing, what other options? If you can't imagine yourself doing or being something, you're not going to pursue it, right? They're just not options. So I think we do internalize, some by osmosis through the community, like you're describing, and some through the media. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. Anything else you want to add about the gang experience? Did I lose you? Oh, I think you're frozen.
Are you back?
Okay, there we go. Yeah, you were frozen.
You were frozen too. So
Okay.
we were both frozen.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah, I heard your question though.
Okay.
So what I would add to that would be this. I was under the impression that the gang made me who I am, and I will not deny that it influenced my experience, right? That I also have come to the understanding today, and this is just, for anybody that ends up working with some young folks, or if a young person ends up hearing some snippet from this, my gang didn't make me who I am today. My gang kept me for so many years from being who I am today. And so, like, that's the perspective that I have now.
That person that you wanted your daughter to see too, right?
Right, absolutely.
Right. Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the school to prison pipeline. Can you tell us a little about what that is and how it disproportionately impacts communities of color?
The school to prison pipeline. Well, we know a few things. We know that a person that doesn't graduate high school is much more likely to end up incarcerated than somebody who does. And we also know that, unfortunately, a disproportionate number of folks of color do not finish high school compared to their white counterparts. So, you do the math, it's pretty easy to figure out that because a lot of people of color do not finish the traditional educational system, they end up in prison. So there definitely is this school to prison pipeline where kind of, for a lot of folks, it happens exactly that way. One day they're in high school and the next thing they're, doing a life sentence in prison. I met many men in prison when I was there that were 18 years old, that had been tried as adults at the age of 16 or 17. And for me to judge a child, which they still were at the age of 16 or 17, and sentence them to spend the rest of their life in prison is just barbaric, cruel, and it's inhumane, and it doesn't happen anywhere else in the world, right? So there's definitely a school to prison pipeline. It exists, and it is still affecting children of color in a disproportionate way, unfortunately, and I think that is a reflection of the investments that we've chosen to make as a society. Here in California, we built more prisons than we did universities. And so that tells us as a society exactly where our money is invested, who our bets are on, right? And it's sad to know that, and things are changing, right? But it's sad to know that for a period of time, you could predict, depending on a child's grades and test scores in elementary school, you could already predict whether that child would end up becoming incarcerated or not. That's a sad statistic to be able to predict. And because we're able to predict it, that tells me that we're also able to change it, right? Because if you know something's happening and it's gonna happen, then you can do some things differently. And as a community, we've started to invest in things that are different. We've started to divest from some prisons. We've started to look at different ways of approaching the justice system and sentencing people, but we still have a lot more work to do.
Especially when it comes to young people, because I think the other thing I've read about and heard a little bit about some programs I've participated in is the policing that happens in high schools in communities of color. So whereas a child, we're talking about children here, might commit a minor infraction as a child, but then because there's a police presence on the campus, they end up routed through the criminal justice system at a very early age. Whereas if you live in an affluent neighborhood, you're going to have maybe a session with your counselor. It gets handled there's different resources available to handle a very similar infraction, but it's handled very differently. So these young children that are growing up in urban communities of, predominantly African Americans or Latinx communities, they end up shunted into the criminal justice system and not even given a chance.
Right.
I don't know what your experience is with that. Is that something you've experienced growing up or seen?
I definitely experienced it growing up, but it still exists, and so I'd rather talk about what's happening right now with that, because I've been able to experience some things recently, not through myself, but through other folks that I work with. You know, I get to coordinate a coalition here in Long Beach called the Long Beach Coalition for Safety and Justice. And one of the things that we're working on is youth diversion. And how does the city of Long Beach approach that? How does Long Beach Unified approach that? How does the Long Beach Police Department approach that? How does the DA, the city attorney, and the city prosecutor, how do they look at diversion, and what are they doing in that space? Because we discovered something. So, you know, the County of Los Angeles has a lot of resources in funding, and they are funding some diversion work here in the city of Long Beach, and they've allotted to some organizations, you know, money and slots to serve folks, especially kids that could be diverted to restorative organizations, as opposed to, you know, being incarcerated.
Mm-hmm.
What we discovered is that in one of those contracts, there are 50 slots that are available that there's funding for. So 50 kids could be served, that could be referred from the Long Beach Unified School District and their safety police to this organization. And so what we discovered is that there were 5 referrals, 45 remained empty and unused. The 5 referrals were for vaping in a bathroom at Cubberley Middle School, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so here's where that rubs me the wrong way. First of all, it's very hard to get funding for these type of practices, for diversion and for restorative practices. So, you know, the fact that it's there and that it's not being used tells me that there's something wrong, because I refuse to believe, maybe I'm just very ignorant, but I refuse to believe that the only situation where there could have been some diversion was a situation where 5 young girls were vaping in a bathroom, right? I've been part of Long Beach Unified. I have a child in Long Beach Unified. Even in elementary school, which he's in, I have seen and witnessed and also heard of much more serious incidents where there could be some diversion, there could be something like that, right? So the fact that the school system itself is not utilizing the resources tells me that there's something wrong, right? But that's just to really continue to point out that, you know, the 5 young girls that, you know, were diverted, as opposed to having any other consequences. And by diversion, I mean, you know, they had to do they had to get mentored, they had to do some groups. And I'm not saying there's no value in that for those young girls, but they were all white young girls. And so, you know, it's just hard for me living the life that I've lived and being part of these same systems. It's hard for me to believe that there weren't any other situations where the school system could have diverted and not sent some kids to the city jail and then to, you know, juvenile hall eventually, because we know that did happen for quite a few kids in Long Beach Unified before they shut down from the pandemic, obviously. But we do know that many kids were arrested on school property, were taken to the city jail and then taken to juvenile hall and ended up, you know, being on probation or being, you know, having to serve, you know, a camp term, things like that. We know those things did happen. And so I don't know if maybe some of those kids should have been diverted. They should have been referred, but it's just not happening, you know? And so that's my curiosity. I was like, why isn't it happening?
When you look at our faith traditions, I would say most faith traditions address, you know, they might use the term sin, making mistakes, you know, none of us are perfect, but they always come from this restorative practice, right? Or what we call now restorative justice models. I have one really great story, actually, because I know a lot of people are not familiar with the term. Actually, I remember being at an event last year and right before the elections, and people are running for, you know, they're running to be judge or to be a DA somewhere, and somebody asked the candidate, what do you think about criminal justice reform, and what do you think about restorative justice? And the person stammered, yes, I believe in restorative justice. It's a good thing. And I was chuckling. I was like, I am pretty sure we're not familiar with that term and what it really looks like. But I have one really great example for people who are not familiar. I know a young man who was 13 years old, and I believe he was under the influence. I'm not sure about that. He may or may not have been, but he was below driving age, right? So he gets in his dad's pickup truck and takes it out for a joyride in the neighborhood, and he smashes into a neighbor's house, destroying a lot of property. And I was so impressed by the sentence that the judge came up with. She assigned him the task. He had, I think, a year or a year and a half to complete this project. He had to go physically visit the site of 3 drunk driving accidents, talk to the families, learn their story, and then write that up, and then show up at, I don't know how it was done, like a hearing or what it was, and then share those stories out loud. I just thought that was such a beautiful way, in a meaningful way, allowing a young person to really reflect and think about the potential harm of a choice and a decision he made, see its impact. You know, I have kids, I have a son. He doesn't always think before he acts, you know, right. Any of us. Right. You know, so I just think we really need to start pushing, you know, elections are coming around again and again, and we really need to be pushing this point with anyone that wants our vote. But yeah, that's heartbreaking. I can't imagine. So do you have any idea, why do you think these funds are not being used by these schools to implement the program?
That's what we're in the middle of researching, you know, and so that's part of our work currently with the coalition is really looking at how the district is dealing with not just diversion and those kind of things, but, you know, the disproportionate rate of suspensions for kids of color, the lack of nutritional resources for the schools that are located in communities of color. You know, we feed our kids, you know, some really unhealthy stuff. Looking at how the school district treats English learners. So, you know, a lot of immigrant families here in Long Beach. But yeah, we're in the middle of that work, Sarah. So it's good work, you know, because there's a need. We see the need to dig into that.
Thank you for doing that. And diversion, for anyone, let me just make sure I understand. When you say the word diversion, it refers to diverting people away from the criminal justice system, right?
Right. So as opposed to making a formal arrest and having them, you know, be processed and actually, you know, become part of the system, you know, there's a practice known as diversion where, you know, there can be, you know, alternative methods to dealing with the offense, whatever the offense may be. It usually happens with some lighter stuff, with drug cases and things like that. But that's also one of the things that we're challenging through the coalition is, you know, you really should utilize this for those that it's going to have the most impact on. And those that it's going to have the most impact on are probably those that are, you know, you encounter in some of the more serious situations.
And so once you're in the system, from your own experience, being incarcerated made you an ever more sophisticated, I hate using the term criminal, but that's the term you used.
Right.
For that type of behavior.
Right. It did, you know, it schooled me. It was like going to a university in many ways, you know. I benefited in some negative ways, right? But I benefited hugely from the prison experience as far as knowledge and networking and all of those things, you know, unfortunately.
Well, the one step before somebody serves a sentence, you know, you're arrested and then you have an opportunity sometimes to make bail, right? Mm-hmm. I've always been under this assumption that if you commit a less dangerous crime, a more minor crime, you're offered a bail because you're not considered dangerous and you can pay the bail and return back into the community. And it's really, if you commit a more dangerous crime, you're not going to be offered a bail, or it'll be much more higher, insurmountable, so that you have to be, you know, held in a jail cell earlier. I always thought it had to do with the severity of your crime, but I'm learning that's not the case.
It's not. You know, it does have to some degree something to do with that. But, you know, I think we also have to, it has to be relative to the person's situation, right? You know, someone with access to wealth and access to attorneys and things like that, they're going to have a much better shot at being treated fairly by the system, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that will happen. And that could go either way. They could get treated unfairly in a way that benefits them, right? If they have access to attorneys and able to bail out. You know, that happened to me with, you know, the last case that I was arrested for. Prior to that, I had been arrested twice and went to prison twice. I had fought both of those cases from prison because I couldn't bail out, so I was fighting them from the county jail. And then, you know, this last time, my dad bailed me out. You know, he was able to help me out, bailed me out, and I had a job, so he wanted me to keep the job. And, you know, and then I ended up making a great friend in an attorney, a great criminal defense attorney. And, you know, she provided her services to me pro bono, but I was out. She was a quality attorney. And because of that, you know, the one time that I should have probably received the most time, because I had already been to prison twice, I already had an extensive criminal record. The one time that I should have received more time, I actually was let out on probation. And I think, you know, the fact that I was able to bail out and I wasn't constantly going to court in, you know, in a county jail uniform, where I was able to walk in my own clothes. And there's a narrative there, right? I walk in and I walk out, and I'm not shackled up and I'm not in a uniform. I'm already free. There's, you know, because all of that influences people, because at the end of the day, people make these decisions. It's not a machine. A judge and a jury make these decisions, you know, and the fact that I was able to walk in looking like a non-prisoner, and, you know, I had a competent attorney who had a vested interest at the time, because it didn't become a pro bono case until after. She was getting paid at the time, or that was our arrangement at least. So there was a financial motivation for her to perform well. And so she did, which there isn't with a public defender. There's also not the huge, overwhelming caseload that a public defender is charged with, because it is unfair. The number of people that a public defender has to provide services for in our criminal justice system, you know, and so I don't blame them when they're burnt out, you know, when they're just frustrated, because they get to see so many injustices as well, and so that impacts you. That has an effect on you where you become jaded, and so, you know, you don't get paid the best dollar as being a public servant. But for me, you know, the one time where I was able to do things differently, like I said, you know, I wasn't incarcerated. I was able to fight the case from the streets. I was able to have a real good dialogue with my attorney. She was able to represent me very well. I ended up with probation, you know, and under the law, I should have received a prison sentence. I had prison priors, all of those things. So I should have been incarcerated to a minimum of 9 years.
So you're saying that if you're the same person, let's just say that the crime is the same, but if you have the money to make bail, you can mount a better defense because you have access to private lawyers, and you're not walking into the trial looking like a criminal with the present garb, that impacts you so drastically that even though this was your third, you were given probation, you didn't have to serve time. But if you don't have the funds, you can end up serving, you know, a much longer and harsher sentencing, have a less vigorous defense. So it's not a matter of the nature of the crime, but it's a matter of money. So again, this is a different form of structural injustice having to do with, you know, socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Now, you've talked a little bit about how being incarcerated made you more sophisticated in breaking the law in some ways. But how else did it, I'm just thinking about the fact, according to the Sentencing Project, as of 2001, 1 of every 3 Black boys born in that year could expect to go to prison in his lifetime, and as could 1 of every 6 Latinx men, compared to 1 of every 17 white boys. So many of our young people it's just heartbreaking. As a person of faith, it just doesn't sit well with me. I don't think we're meant to cut human beings off and isolate them in that way from the rest of the world. But can you tell us a little bit about what incarcerated life is like in terms of your physical, mental, and emotional health?
So it's an experience that unfortunately I had to live with for over 13 years of my life. I've been incarcerated for over 13 years of my life, and I'm 47, so that's a pretty big chunk of that life. What I would say first and foremost about incarceration is that it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 4 weeks a month, 12 months a year, for whatever amount of time you're there. It's trauma, 100% of that time. And so anybody that refutes that, I challenge them to tell me any experience where you are removed from your community, those that you love, everything that you know, everything that is familiar to you. For some of us, we are removed and don't have access to our places of worship and those people that we consider our lifelines, right? So you tell me any experience where that happens to you and it's not traumatizing every moment that you have to live that, you know, I find it very challenging to find any situation like that and to call it not traumatizing, I think would be, you know, just being, it's not having sense. So that's what I have to say about it first and foremost, is that it's 100% trauma, right? And so it's a world of physical and emotional trauma, men and women and all types of folks, right? I want to honor all folks, right? So anybody that's incarcerated, they have a traumatic experience that's going to be very unique to them. You know, I was a Southern California Hispanic gang member in the prisons of California. Within the inmate population, that is the alpha of all alphas there. Because of numbers and because of the audacity of their violence, that group, which I was part of, was the dominant group. And so my experience would be very different from, let's say, a Jewish 80-year-old man who I was cellmates with at one time. So they do happen to be in there. An 80-year-old Jewish man that went to prison for a vehicular manslaughter, right? He lost control of his car and he killed someone and he went to prison for it. I am the dominant one in that dynamic. He is the person that has the most to lose, doesn't have anybody to really back him up, any support. So his experience would be very different than mine. But it would be traumatic nonetheless for both of us, right? I experienced a great learning there around a lot of criminal activity, around a lot of negative things. But I also experienced a lot of trauma. I was incarcerated in the 90s, and I was in a prison called Corcoran in Central California, near Corcoran, California. And at that time, there was going on there what was called blood sport. So this is where correctional staff members, correctional officers, lieutenants, sergeants, the warden, where they were all partaking in human blood sport, where they knew that certain ethnic groups and certain gangs didn't get along. And so they would put them in prison yards together to have them fight, and they would gamble on that. And so even me, the dominant, group in prison, was severely traumatized and abused in that way, where I was told right before going out to the yard, you better win this one. All my money's on you, you know, and knowing that could lead not just to, you know, a beating, that could lead to death, because, you know, there were times, one in particular, where I was involved in an altercation with another inmate. We were fighting, and it was a group of us, and correctional staff killed one of those individuals with a gunshot, with a rifle shot, because they have, you know, live guns in prison, and it was over a fist fight, you know, and so that was severely traumatizing for me, even though up to that point I was the assailant in that situation. But to see this man be killed in front of me was severely traumatizing. So even for the dominant groups, there's this constant trauma and abuse that goes on. And so, you know, things have started to change, but not enough. There's still a lot of turmoil and conflict, and the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation is really going through some tough times right now around the integration of yards and protecting people, and, you know, and now with the COVID and all those things. So I can only imagine what it's like, but it's this constant trauma of being away from the food you love, the people you love, being away from fresh air, being away from everything, you know, and just being in this very artificial, concrete environment full of, you know, hustle, deceit, violence, and corruption. You know, it's very sad. It's a very sad place when I look back at it. It's just a severely sad, traumatic experience, no matter who you are.
We are lying to ourselves if we think our prison system is rehabilitative.
Right, right.
No, but this also brings us to the question, you know, who is worthy of love and forgiveness, right? Because you'll hear people that just believe that, you know, there are criminals and there are non-criminals, and criminals should be locked up and sent away, never to be seen again. But we know in most value systems and in most faith traditions, every human being represents a life and a soul that's worthy of love and forgiveness. I was just telling a friend, she's a reverend, and we were joking. We were like, even Trump is a human being with a soul. And I have to try to remind myself at times that I should pray for him.
Yes.
I should be praying for him, actually. You know, that may he be imbued with wisdom and compassion for other humans. But I mean, when we approach the criminal justice system, we really need to think about who is worthy of love and forgiveness. I know in my tradition, we are told, again in the Quran, that up into our last breath, we can make amends and ask for forgiveness. Of course, there has to be an act of making amends, but to resign a group of people as being less than human and not worthy, that just seems such a human rights violation. So thank you so much for sharing in such an, I'm just thinking there's just so much in your story and what you've shared. I didn't even touch back on your son. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, because you might look at that event in your life in a certain way. You might think about your role in that event. But I also think about my role. I think as human beings, we're inherently connected to one another, right? And this pandemic is showing us that, right? What happens in far off places, whether we're talking about different physical locations, whether it's China or India or Africa or the United States, what happens across the planet affects each one of us here, right? What happens between different groups of people, the choices I make, the things I buy, you know, the place I live, right? I mean, when I put gas in my car, I'm supporting poor air quality for some other human being at that time, right? When I'm choosing how to vote, I'm impacting how maybe some elected is going to legislate on whether or not there's restorative justice being implemented or not. So I feel, I'm sure if we sat down and mapped it out, I am sure that my life in some way connects to the loss of your son's life. It's all connected in some way.
Right.
So it hurts me. And,
I appreciate that, Sarah. I appreciate that. And just to expand on that a little bit, you know, people often ask me about that time and, you know, about what I think about and how it's impacted my life. And so, my son and I, we're good. We're real good. The last words that we spoke to each other were, "I love you," the night before he died. And I feel that that was something, a gift that the Creator gave me. But he's in a much better place, and that's not just for me, something to say. I really believe that, because he was a child that suffered with the same barriers that I suffered because he was brown like me. What I think about now when I think about his death is, I often think about those two young Black men. They were two young African American men that killed my son, and it was out of a gang rivalry, but also something that has turned into a racial conflict here in the city of Long Beach between Black and brown. So I often wonder, and this goes back to the connectedness that you refer to. I think, how did I fail them? How did we fail those two young men that devalued themselves and their lives and their freedom, right? Because you kill somebody, there's either a prison sentence or retribution on the other side of that, right? Revenge. And so they didn't value their lives. They didn't value their freedom. Why? What happened to them? How did we fail them as a community, as a society? Why were they at that point in their lives? Because they went on a 3-day shooting spree. My son was the only person that died, but they shot 6 other people over the course of 3 days.
Yeah.
We know that because it was the same vehicle, the same 2 individuals. They were never caught. I don't know where they're at. They may be dead. They may be in prison. They may be my next door neighbor. I don't know. But I still wonder, how did I fail them? How did we fail them?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm so glad that you shared your last exchange with your son. What a gift and a privilege, because many of us don't say "I love you" to each other often enough. I have a son. My husband says to him, "I love you" every day, and he just kind of goes. And my husband's like, actually, we literally just had this conversation yesterday. My husband's like, "Man, why can't you?" And my son's only 11. It's like, "Why can't you say I love you back?" And he's like, my son's like, "It's not my thing, Dad." So what a gift. I'm so grateful that you had that silver lining there, that you parted with love. You have a son now.
I do. And I have another son. So I have my 7-year-old son. Yes. And I have a 28-year-old son.
Lovely. And a daughter.
And I have 2 daughters. So I have Isabel and Josie. Josie's 21 and Isabel's 28.
Lovely. But I know you're working very hard right now with your local nonprofit based in Long Beach to help foster a different world for all of our children. Can you tell us a little bit about your nonprofit, Restore Inc.? What is it that you do, and why do you do it?
Absolutely. And thank you for allowing me to speak about, the great work that I get to be a small part of. So I'm co-founder of an organization here in Long Beach, a very small, I always call it a little baby org called Restore Inc. And so it's INK. And that kind of represents a couple of things, right? So first of all, I'm inked up, so that's one thing. And Pastor Kyle also is a lover of tattoos, so he's kind of an oddball Lutheran pastor that's full of tattoos. So, and our other co-founders got a lot of ink too, so that's kind of one thing. But the INK really does have a meaning. Each letter represents a different part of our mission, right? So because we're about restoring 3 things, and that's what the INK stands for. We stand for restoring identity, narrative, and kinship. Because and the folks that we serve are the gang members and their communities and families that are impacted by their lifestyle, as well as the formerly incarcerated. We're very grassroots, very small. It's just the 3 of us, Pastor Kyle Blake of the Gathering Lutheran Church, myself, and our other co-founder is a gentleman by the name of Miguel Lugo. And he's a Yaqui native, but he's also a Long Beach native. We were actually part of the same gang when we grew up. and now we do this work. So our mission is really to serve those folks that nobody else will serve. Is to serve those folks that won't let themselves be served by anybody else. So we do a lot of mentoring. We do a lot of outreach, a lot of referrals, but at the core of our mission is building a relationship with those gang members to let them know that when they make that choice to do something different, there is something different on the other side of the choice. And we do our best to connect them to those different things, different organizations, different work that we partake in. We just try to connect them to something different. And that comes in very many different ways. Mm-hmm. So one of the practices that we take on is, breaking bread. And that's what we call it. We have different funders that will fund a dinner with 2 or 3 folks, sometimes with just one individual, where we just break bread and talk about their life and build community with them and make it something where the line between service recipient and service deliverer is erased. And it's just about building a relationship as human beings and understanding that our mission is to provide them resources and knowledge to have a different life if they choose to do so. We're not interventionists. We don't do gang intervention. We don't even do gang rehab, which is what I did when I was with Homeboy Industries. What I really believe we do and what we are is a community of kinship that focuses on serving the formerly incarcerated and gang impacted communities of Long Beach. And so we've worked with, all sorts of different gang members. One of my best experiences has been with, we have an extensive Samoan community here in Long Beach. And, I met this man named June, who had just been incarcerated for 18 years. And he was a member of the local Samoan gang here in Long Beach. And what this man needed really was just some time with other people. He had served 18 years and his plan was to go live with his wife up in Northern California. And he wasn't able to do that because his mother was sick when he got out. And so he had to come back to Long Beach and take care of his mother. And so this became a very heavy burden and a very heavy weight for him. And so what Restore Inc. did was we were just that support. We were that ear. We would take him out to dinner every week. We'd go over to his house once in a while. We'd do grocery runs for him if he needed them. We'd go buy dinner for him and his family if that's what he needed at the time. But we were just that reprieve that he needed in this overwhelming experience of not only reentering the community after being incarcerated for 18 years, but now having to take care of his mother. So that's one piece of our work. I've done things where, I have jobs with other organizations and there's an opportunity to employ a young person for some work. And for me, it's really about them making a little money, but also about an opportunity for that person and I to start to build a relationship and for them to understand that they can have a different way of life. Because I came from the same places they came from, and I'm doing something different now, So that's the work we do. It's very grassroots, Sarah. Hiking, camping with kids that ain't never been out there, stuff like that.
Would you call it a re-entry program, or is that not an accurate use of the term?
Absolutely, because we deal with that so much. So we deal with folks fresh out, and although we don't provide some of the direct services, we're very well connected in the community and know who to refer them to. So we become that navigator for them, that kind of that shepherd, where we say, we've already walked this path many times. Mm-hmm. Let us help you walk it. And I might not know the answer, but I will take you to who does have the answer for you on this particular problem, this particular issue. Because of my background professionally, I spent over a decade at Homeboy Industries with Father Greg, and I ended up going from a participant in the program to an executive and part of the management team there. But because of that, when somebody needs a resume, I'm able to help them with it. Those kind of things I'm still able to do for folks that we help through Restore Inc. But it's become much more of a relationship building community.
That's beautiful. So you're there for them, and I love the name. So you're through this relationship, it seems like together you're restoring identity. And we talked about that, how you had a certain identity that other people saw, but you knew you were something more and something else. So restoring that sense of self. Narrative, is that kind of taking back your story.
Yes,
And
you're
then
right on.
And then kinship, being that family for one another, so people don't have to fall back into those old, maybe whether it's gang relationships or toxic relationships, traumatic relationships. That is absolutely beautiful. How has the COVID pandemic impacted the individuals you usually serve? How has it impacted your ability to serve them? How are you guys managing right now?
You know, I mean, it's become a lot of phone calls as opposed to one-on-ones at the beach or at the park or over dinner. You know, a lot of Zoom stuff. You know, and it's impacted us. You know, we like you said earlier, you alluded to it. You know, there's this connectedness that we have as human beings, and yes, this is great, right? We get to see each other's face, but I mean, just the vibe and the energy that we give off when we're in spaces together also influences the way we relate to one another.
Yes.
You know, we feel that energy when somebody really cares about us and they're coming from a genuine place. There's an energy in it, you know, and so that's impacted. The pandemic has impacted that. You know, the ability to build relationships around that. But you know, we're resourceful. We've done what we can, but you know, we're just doing what is safe for us and safe for the folks that we get to serve. And for the most part, they understand that, you know, and you know, some of the orgs that we get to refer folks to are still operating, so we're still able to do some of those things, but you know, they're impacted as well. So it's been a time of getting creative. Yeah. and being willing to step into the unknown and something new and uncomfortable. You know, when I mentor and when I get to talk to young people, and not necessarily always young people, like when I get to talk to somebody about a shared experience, you know, there's something about that being in the space, and sometimes just the silence, you need it. And when we're on Zoom and when we're on the phone, there's this need to talk because there shouldn't be in this empty space, right? Yeah. Sometimes I've discovered that the most therapeutic time and moment for me has been when I've just like vented and talked about something that just moved me and traumatized me, and the other person just sat in silence and listened. You know, so not being able to do that, it's been frustrating. It's impacted me on a personal level because that's why I do what I do, for that feeling, for that moment, right? Of relationship with any other human being. That's what I live for now. So not having that in that way, yeah, it's challenging, but people still need to you know, have access to services. They still need to have access to each other. So we do what we can with what we have.
That is so right, true. That the Zoom interaction, it's not at all natural. Like I know when I'm teaching or having a larger meeting, I was telling my husband, I'm exhausted at the end because I have to be so much more animated, right? You're using a lot more facial expression and, you know, to keep people engaged. Here we were having a very deep conversation, so we could focus a little bit more on the content. But I know when you're leading meetings or you're teaching, it's not the same connection. What can someone who's watching right now, what can someone like me do to help support your work?
There's a couple of things, and you know, we talked about this before we started this, and so I've been thinking about it. You know, of course, folks are always welcome, and I invite them to go on our website and donate through the green donate button they'll see on their, either on their computer screen or on their phone, and they just got to go to www.restoreinc, that's with an ink.org. And they can learn a little bit more about all three co-founders there, and some of our work and some of our dreams. But the other way, you know, as we come out of this pandemic, you know, one of the things that we have talked about implementing at Restore Inc. is a tutor program. because a lot of our folks want to get their high school diplomas, or they've gotten them while they're incarcerated and they want to enroll in college and things like that. Our folks are coming out with the ability to dream a little bit more now. So, as we start to dive into other spaces that we don't have expertise in, volunteering. So dropping us an email and letting us know if you want to volunteer and what your expertise is and why you want to volunteer. That's really important for me, those conversations with people too, because I know that's something that folks are interested in doing and want to do, is volunteer. And there's different ways, so absolutely, just contact us, and once we get out of this pandemic, Restore Inc. has been making some plans. So be looking for us to really be a lot more active in the Long Beach community with those folks that we get to serve.
Yes, and the SCIC would love to continue being in partnership and fellowship with you. So that's great. So that's 2 Help the Helpers calls this week. So 1, people can make a donation to help support your work at restoreinc.org, and we'll put up the web link at the end. And 2, if you have a skill or a talent that you can teach and are interested in tutoring one of the individuals that Jose works with, that is something they're also looking for. And if so, you can contact Restore Inc. What's the best way to contact you? Is there an email?
Yeah, so they can email me at Jose@Restore Inc. No, I'm sorry, that's JOSUNA. J Osuna. Osuna is my last name. JOsuna@restoreinc.org. That's the problem with having a bunch of different emails. Like 4, so.
I still have my old Yahoo. My kids are like, Mom, you're supposed to have a Gmail. I'm like, to transfer over everything will take forever. So I'm still stuck on my really ancient one. My husband has a Hotmail.
Oh, man. My dad has Yahoo still. I haven't heard of anybody having a Hotmail lately.
My husband has a Hotmail. So we'll put up the contact information. This would be also a good time for us to give a shout out and thank you to Omar Hakim of Encourage and ILM Foundation for connecting us. I'm so grateful that Omar connected us so we could have this conversation and hopefully initiate a long-term relationship, right?
Absolutely.
That's what this is. It's not just a one-off thing. We're also a grassroots baby organization, and we strongly believe in working together, in community, in network. So I'm really grateful to Omar because I know he's doing the work too.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Jose, is there anything else you want to add before we close for today? We've talked a lot.
We have. I would just say this. I will share, I think, what my greatest learning is in life. I'll leave it with that. I've learned to get out of my own way. And that, I think, is the greatest learning. Sometimes there's this curiosity, this very, very noble curiosity within me to do something good, to meet somebody new, to do something different, and I get in my own way. And so that would be my message to any of your folks from your board, folks that you network with, whoever's going to end up watching this. Sometimes we just got to get out of our own way. If this kind of work interests you, if the community that I spoke about intrigues you, it's probably coming from a good place. So the best thing that you can probably do is get out of your own way. Let yourself explore it. Let yourself walk into it.
Because Jose, the water is just okay. Take that down.
Perfect.
Yes. Jose, thank you so much for entrusting us with your story and for allowing us to benefit from your experience and to hopefully lift all of us. I'd also, again, like to thank Omar Hakim of Encourage and ILM Foundation. I'd like to thank our SCIC staff, our Executive Director, Milia Islam Majid and Cheryl Bentz, as well as our wonderful board of directors. Thank you to our awesome video editor, Haris Sef, and to all of you who spent the last, actually it's more than an hour. It was just such an important conversation. Thank you for sticking with us, for watching and listening. Let's all stay safe, stay healthy, and continue helping one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
To learn more about implicit bias, we invite you to visit the website for Project Implicit, hosted by implicit.harvard.edu/implicit. To learn more about systemic racial disparities in the American criminal justice system, we invite you to visit the website for the Sentencing Project at sentencingproject.org. The SCIC invites you to help the helpers this week by 1. Making a much-needed donation to Restore Inc. by visiting their website at restoreinc.org and click on Donate in the upper right-hand corner. Or 2. Volunteer as a tutor for one of Restore Inc.'s formerly incarcerated and gang-impacted members and be a part of someone's journey towards healing and rehabilitation. If you're interested in learning more, email Jose at josuna@restoreinc.org. That's JOSUNA@restoreinc.org. We invite you to connect with Restore Inc. by visiting their website, restoreinc.org, and with the South Coast Interfaith Council by following our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/SC Interfaith, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to follow our projects at www.youtube.com/user/SC Interfaith. The South Coast Interfaith Council would like to extend heartfelt gratitude to Jose Osuna of Restore Inc., Omar Hakim of Encourage, Ilm Foundation and Humanitarian Day, Milia Islam Majid of the South Coast Interfaith Council, Cheryl Bentz of the South Coast Interfaith Council, the Board of Trustees at the South Coast Interfaith Council, and Haris Saif for his awesome video editing.